The best feature about horror as a concept and a genre in entertainment is that it doesn't have a specific format or shape, meaning that it can be implemented in various ways so that you can't even recognize the connection between multiple experiences. Horror is simply subjective, and it differs from one person's perspective to another. However, the most mysterious kinds of horror games that I personally admire are the ones that hide horror and try to convince you it's not even there, or at least cover it with another theme. So when typical players encounter a game like Manhunt, many of them feel confused and begin to question why it's classified as a horror title, since on the surface it appears to be just an action game. But for horror enthusiasts, the identity of Manhunt is not open for debate, and they can clearly see why it's a horror game through and through, and also why it has a type of horror that feels more genuine than the usual formula. With that being said, the reason that led me to come up with this video is not just the fictional story within the game itself, but also the real-life inspirations that fueled the developer's imagination. I was curious about this because despite the gruesome nature of Manhunt's story, something about it felt real to me, and I was convinced that the idea is rooted in real-life practices. Anyway, without further ado, let's find out why Manhunt is notorious for being the most banned video game in history. Manhunt has a very simple story. But frankly, that's basically among the reasons why it's insanely disturbing and why the explicit nature of your terrifying mission is normalized. The protagonist here is a man named James Cash, and he's a mysterious figure whose extended background we don't really know much about. However, what we know is that James is a convicted murderer who has a long history of violence, and he was sentenced to death for his crimes. James was planned to be executed by lethal injection, and he was taken to the execution chamber to face his punishment once and for all.
James Earl Cash, found guilty and sentenced to death, has been on death row for the past 3 years and was executed last night.
But strangely enough, just when the media and authorities thought the process was done, James somehow wakes up in a bizarre room and finds out that he was only sedated to lose his consciousness. A few seconds later, he begins to hear a voice talking in his ears through a device. And eventually, the man behind the voice identifies himself as the director. This ambiguous man is a former film producer named Lionel Starkweather, and he has an offer for James that supposedly can help him regain his freedom. This is when the plot becomes twisted, because Lionel is actually a psychopath, and his offer for James is nothing but absolute madness.
Hey, easy. Look, you've had an unexpected reprieve. Do exactly as I say, and I promise this will be over before the night is out.
Using the earpiece, Lionel wants to guide James and force him to kill certain people during multiple missions. But the catch is that Lionel is also recording these murders to create snuff films. In other words, the game is structured into scenes where James must survive by stealthily killing many opponents, who are mostly gang members and other criminals. These criminals want to kill him too, and they're going through the same deadly show just like him, because the mastermind behind these horrifying encounters is none other than Lionel Starkweather. Lionel is doing this because he wants to film as many scenes as possible of people dying in various circumstances, and he loves to enjoy the thrill of watching real humans suffering and desperate to survive. In fact, Lionel's sadistic desires are implemented in the game's mechanics, because the more gruesome the executions, the better the player's rating, which means that you are encouraged to kill by using the most aggressive and painful methods at your disposal. So to summarize it for you as simply as possible, James is a criminal who was given a chance to evade punishment, but this chance was given to him by an even worse criminal who has a bizarre obsession with documenting ruthlessness. James's entire mission is satisfying this man's bloodthirst by killing people however he can. But to understand why Manhunt caused so much controversy after its release, you need first to learn about the spine-chilling phenomenon that inspired it. When Manhunt was released in late 2003, the game sold reasonably well despite its uniquely outlandish style. However, the people who had a serious problem with it were not necessarily the players or consumers in general, but it was actually the media, critics, and even authorities. Not just with the original game, but also with the sequel later on.
Manhunt 2 is so violent, it's been banned in Britain. In fact,
the first one was a very violent game. It was completely, kill everything as hard as you can. I mean, there's so many different ways to kill stuff.
Although violence was not exclusive to Manhunt at the time, what really triggered the opposition was the motivations and reasons behind that violence in the game.
But while killing characters in a video game is nothing new, it is how it's done in this game.
First of all, the story was seen as problematic from the beginning, and the protagonist himself was not making it any better. James is a criminal and a killer who somehow evaded justice to participate in gruesome missions just to be free again. So the hero here is not even innocent, and the game doesn't try to portray him as a good guy. He's simply a man who needs to kill, and he is rewarded for performing more violent and gruesome kills with a rating system that literally encourages brutality. This lack of morality in the game was among the red flags that made it controversial, because the goal is entirely based on you being violent, for the sake of being violent. Nevertheless, the straw that broke the camel's back was actually much more sophisticated than James's actions, and it's mostly about Lionel Starkweather. In case you don't know, the idea of snuff films is highly sensitive for authorities, and many officials were genuinely worried that the game might be encouraging or glorifying it. For those of you who are not familiar with this term, snuff films are simply media or videos that showcase the actual murder of a real person. But the scary twist is that it's filmed specifically for entertainment or profit. Many of you might wonder how there's an audience for such films, but the sad reality is that this question is naive, because the number of psychopaths who would enjoy watching this stuff is much higher than you think. As a result, Manhunt was banned in several countries worldwide, and even in the United States, the developers were disappointed by the rating and age limit, which pushed them to change many details in the game in order for popular retailers to allow it on their shelves.
But just 6 days after its launch, Target Corporation responded to the pressure and decided to yank Manhunt from the shelves.
The British response was basically the most intense, because if you secretly sell the game to people or promote it, you can find yourself spending 2 years in a prison cell. But the real question is, do snuff films really exist? Or are they just an urban legend that people talk about due to curiosity? Well, the answer is complicated because even though there has been no conclusive verified evidence of a commercially produced snuff film, the general theme might exist in different formats. The reason I say this is because authorities have a specific definition of what a snuff film is, and they exclude other media that might seem similar. For instance, some criminal organizations tend to film the murders and heinous actions they commit, but they mainly do it for intimidation and propaganda, meaning that they want to seem tough and scare their competitors. However, in 2011, a shocking event took place in Mexico that immediately made me remember the scenario of Manhunt more than anything else. In April of that year, a major criminal organization in the state of Tamaulipas began setting up roadblocks and pseudo-police checkpoints on Mexican Federal Highway 101, which was intended to force commercial passenger buses to stop. Once the bus stopped, gunmen would storm the vehicle, demand to see cell phones and ID, and then point at specific passengers and order them to get off. They did this with several buses, and every time they ordered certain passengers to step out, they were mostly young men and women who appeared healthy and physically capable. The operation resulted in capturing dozens of people over multiple days, and even though the motivations behind this sophisticated abduction are various, the most disturbing one was something known as the gladiator ritual. After leaving the scene at gunpoint, the victims were taken to remote ranches where men and women were separated to serve completely different purposes, yet equally harrowing and distressing. The women were exploited for their bodies to the fullest extent, and they were also put into forced domestic labor, where they needed to cook and clean for the criminals. On the other side, the men were the ones chosen to participate in what I previously mentioned as the terrifying gladiator ritual. In order to decide which men are stronger and more useful for the ruthless organization, the gang members forced the helpless victims to literally fight each other in a battle for survival where no one can really win. Instead of guns, they were required to use their own hands or melee weapons like sledgehammers, machetes, or clubs, but the twist is that the fight cannot be finished unless there is one man standing and the other is dead. This is brutality in its ultimate form, and according to experts who specialize in investigating these incidents, it's very possible that these fights were recorded for personal entertainment or sent to rival gangsters for intimidation. This horror lasted for at least 120 days, resulting in dozens of men dying in the fights, while the ones who refused to participate were executed by gunshot or torture. To put it in a nutshell, this heartbreaking incident led to a massacre in which more than 190 people were killed, including both the men and women. Their remains were only discovered in a mass grave after several months of the tragedy, and after a thorough examination, it was suggested that the criminal operation was probably ongoing since January 2011 and police were turning a blind eye. This is not a coincidence because it turned out that multiple police officers were complicit and they got paid by the gangsters to pretend that nothing was happening. What made it relatively convenient for them was that most of the victims were vulnerable migrants from Central America. And since their presence in a foreign country is already challenging, they become an easy target for such crimes. Now I want you to recall all the details I mentioned about this diabolic massacre, and try to compare it to what happens in Manhunt. First of all, the gladiator ritual is precisely what the game is all about when it comes to the gameplay and your survival. Your entire mission is to fight other men in a situation where survival depends on killing them before they kill you. Not necessarily because they're evil, but because they're also fighting for their lives. Not only that, if you focus on the clues and environmental storytelling in the game, you'll realize that Lionel Starkweather was working with corrupt police officers to organize these fights freely and ensure that the protagonist is unable to escape. These similarities are not accidental. Although the real-life event I highlighted occurred years after the game's release, it's actually a fact that the developers of Manhunt were heavily inspired by real-world practices among criminal organizations that had existed for decades. With that said, despite the gruesome nature of the incident, experts don't classify it as related to snuff films, even if videos were recorded. The reasoning is that the footage was not made for profit or commercial distribution, which is a key criterion for something to be considered a snuff film. The second type of media that authorities exclude is people who record a murder for the sake of documentation or fame, which has become more common recently with the rise of social media. For example, in 2017 in the state of Ohio, a man by the name of Steve Stevens started making uncanny videos on Facebook speaking about his financial struggle, mental collapse, and his unstable relationship with his partner, Joy Lane.
All because of this bitch named Joy Lane. You know, she put me in my pushing point, man.
Steve was known for gambling, and apparently this horrible habit led him to lose his money and eventually his sanity. He was speaking constantly about how much he loves his partner, but over time, it seems his gambling issue became a serious problem in the relationship.
The gambling is a deal breaker. It's me or gambling.
Subsequently, his Facebook videos were getting increasingly bizarre, and he was mumbling about a plan to kill people in order to cope with his frustration. He was talking casually about his intentions to murder people randomly, and he even stated he had already annihilated 13 victims. At that point, no one was taking him seriously, and people assumed he was being funny. However, on April 16, 2017, Steven uploaded a video on Facebook showing him talking again in his car, but this time, he saw a random old man passing by, and he literally said that he's going to kill him. This seemed like a joke, but little did people know, Steven actually grabbed his gun and approached the old man before demanding him to say Joy Lane, which is the name of his partner. The old man was confused and complied with the request, but a few seconds later, he was tragically taken down point blank. The victim was 74-year-old Robert Godwin, and he was an innocent grandpa minding his own business on the street, but his only sin is that he was in the wrong place at the wrong time. He was a family man and beloved among his daughters, grandchildren, and neighbors. But sadly, in this world, minding your own business is not enough to survive and live in peace. Following a massive manhunt, Stephen's body was found a few days later, meaning that he put an end to his days in life before his arrest. Police found no evidence suggesting that he killed anyone else. And even though the video is not by definition a snuff film, the fact that it was recorded so casually in broad daylight and uploaded for the public makes the entire story pure horror.
Nationwide manhunt for the suspect who posted that crime on Facebook.
The final type of media that should logically be classified as a snuff film, despite lacking the commercial side, is videos made by sadistic individuals for their personal desires in private. A spine-chilling example of such a person is Sean Fiore. In 2018, this psychopath from the state of Vermont got in touch with a woman in Venezuela and paid her $600 to produce a video depicting the torture of a human. But he specifically requested that the person in question shouldn't be a capable adult. And I think you get what I mean. Sean found pleasure in such content, and 1 month later he actually received the video, and it contained the jarring material he wanted. This pushed his craziness to go one step further, and he offered the woman $4,000 to produce a second video containing specific detailed methods of torture, including urinating, kicking, and burning. But this time, he wanted the victim to be older, and also to be exterminated in the ending. The woman was equally satanic as him, because she somehow managed to send him a 58-minute video containing exactly what he wanted, including the victim's demise. The video was obtained by authorities later on, and they couldn't believe what their eyes were seeing because it precisely included what he asked for. Sean was sentenced to 27 years in jail for his horrifying crimes, and the woman was arrested in 2020 in Colombia before her extradition to the US in 2021, where she faced decades in jail. What really shocked me the most about this case is that the guy you see here is not a gangster or some sort of a career criminal. Instead, he's actually a hardworking nurse who was described as a kind and helpful individual by his colleagues. In other words, he was living a double life where he smiles at your face during the day and seems like he's doing everything he can for your safety, but at night, he satisfies his sadistic desires by watching the most depraved videos possible. It was reported that he had an obsession with intimate and aggressive videos that involve younger people. And even though he was married and had a normal life with his wife, he was still twisted behind the scenes.
Sean Fiore was caught with images of porn prosecutors say were the worst of the worst. And then they discovered he hired a woman from Venezuela to kidnap and torture people, a young boy she abused, and a man who apparently was killed on camera for Fiore's viewing pleasure.
The reason I highlighted his ordinary background and lifestyle is because in the game Manhunt, Lionel Starkweather was a popular director and a respected figure in society due to his successful career in movie making before his downfall. So, in a way, the game wants you to realize that many of the people who take pleasure in such heinous videos and media are not necessarily the stereotypical criminals you might imagine. Rather, they could be your neighbor, your colleague, or even your nurse. However, now that I have explained the types of media that may resemble snuff films but are not legally classified as such, it's time to present the one example in which all the conditions are met, and where I can safely say it is, quite literally, a snuff film. In February 2025, a number of videos and photos began appearing for sale on dark web platforms, and strangely enough, they had a reasonably low price to catch as many eyeballs as possible. Initially, no one knew about them outside of a small group of special online users who are familiar with exploring the dark web and watching horrible stuff on it. But several months later, in July 2025, the same content found its way to more popular spaces on the internet, like encrypted apps, gore sites, and forums like Baidu. The content consisted of about 11 videos and nearly 100 photos, and they all showed the same people and the same place because they're all about one particular event. These videos and photos show two individuals from various angles, and even though the atmosphere seems peaceful and calm in the beginning, as time goes on, you discover that you're literally watching someone being killed and his body being dismembered. The problem was the lack of context because viewers had no idea who these people were or whether what they were watching was actually real. But as the content spread more and more, some people started spotting tiny details that can help in determining the location where the video was recorded. For instance, Asian viewers were able to identify the local brands and architecture style in the video. And according to their analysis, the setting appears to be a tiled room in Vietnam or nearby Cambodia. Over time, the case's controversy was getting more intriguing for online investigators, and eventually it became a topic of discussion on major platforms like Reddit and Twitter. This is when viewers became determined to crowdsource every clue possible from the videos, such as tattoos, clothing, floor tiles, and tools, to piece together identities and locations. After a thorough examination of every angle, they were finally convinced that the location is definitely a region in Vietnam, specifically a province in the northern part of the country. When it comes to the guy who's being killed in the video, his identity was not a complicated mystery for online investigators, because he had a notable presence on multiple websites. The scary part, however, is that these websites are not social media or regular forums, but they're actually the most sadistic and vile spaces on the internet. I will not name them explicitly, but I'm simply talking about websites where people post their extreme fetishes and explain their disgusting fantasies regarding murder and a form of intimacy that involves cruelty. The victim was very active among these online communities, and he frequently shared disturbing desires, which include scenarios that I can't really talk about. But if you want a hint, it's similar to the scenario in the videos. So due to this side of his life, online investigators were able to conclude that the person in the video was none other than Xuan Dat, a 36-year-old man known for extremely bizarre behavior and unstable mental health. However, the identification process was not easy when people wanted to know who the guy wearing the mask was, especially since he's the one doing the horrible crime. This was when authorities finally stepped in and began analyzing the footage in a forensic manner, which sadly confirmed that it was entirely genuine and that a murder had taken place. But even then, police were still relying on sophisticated remarks from people online, including the discovery of a tattoo on the killer's arm, which reads 13-9. This tattoo was interpreted as September 13th, which was suggested as the birthday of someone who's very close to the killer, like a son or a daughter. People online kept watching all the angles of the killer and ended up spotting a scar over one eyebrow, monolid eyes, a receding hairline, and a stocky build. All these clues were used by police to help in reaching the perpetrator. And on November 28, 2025, they finally found their guy in the city of Lang Son, which is located in the northern part of Vietnam, just like social media users speculated. The man in question is Doan Van Sang, a 57-year-old father who used to work as a deputy head of a market surveillance department. It was also revealed that the incident happened on January 25, 2025, when Xuan Dat contacted him on the phone and came to his workplace so they could record the notorious videos. The videos include rehearsals, discussions over positions, and cooperation, which meant that both individuals had been planning this for a while. Anyway, I don't want to talk about it anymore. But long story short, the media that was produced was officially considered the first legitimate snuff film ever. Not because of the content, but because it was purposefully sold for money online, and this was the killer's intention from the beginning. Profit was the main goal, and this triggered the Vietnamese police to expand their investigation and see whether this is really the first time, or if there's a hidden industry lurking behind the shadows. This reminds us of Lionel Starkweather again, because in the game, he's not just producing aggressive films for his personal entertainment, but he's also driven by a financial motive to make as much money as he can from them. In fact, he had a business model where he sells his movies to an underground market of wealthy viewers, willing to pay a premium for the most realistic and depraved content possible. Wealthy individuals seeking out this kind of content is not fictional either. One of the most brutal real-world examples happened in the 1990s, when a group of rich tourists paid Serbian soldiers to shoot innocent civilians in Bosnia purely for their own entertainment, which included children. It was reported that these tourists came from Italy, and they wanted to enjoy watching a manhunt in which defenseless civilians are running for their lives while being shot by snipers. I was honestly left speechless by this. After the crime was revealed recently, it led Italian prosecutors to initiate a massive investigation to expose the perpetrators who paid money just to watch humans become prey. I want you to think about this for a second. The photo you see here might seem normal at first glance, but in reality, it was actually taken from the same event, and it shows an innocent Bosnian woman carrying basic needs and rushing her steps for no reason other than to avoid being shot by a sniper. And speaking of being prey, if you've been paying attention to all the features I mentioned about Lionel Starkweather, you'll notice that I highlighted the real-life counterpart of various sides of his character. This includes his fascination with watching people kill each other to survive, mirroring the incident in Mexico, his personal arousal while observing someone die slowly, similar to the case in Vermont, and his financial greed, which fuels his film operation and echoes the situation in Vietnam. However, the game shows that he also gets excited with the concept of someone becoming prey and being hunted like an animal. He loves the suspense of seeing a victim trying to escape and seeking freedom while being hunted down by a predator at the same time. Well, as you can probably guess, this leads us to another real-life example. The history of crime in America is full of bizarre individuals and so many psychopaths. But if there's a competition to determine the most psychotic one, Robert Hansen is definitely a contender that's hard to beat. Robert Hansen was born in 1939 in the state of Iowa, and during his youth, he was known to be incredibly shy, stuttering when talking, and suffering from severe acne that left him with permanent scars. His father was a Danish immigrant and a baker, but Robert's relationship with him was very difficult due to how strict and domineering he was. As a result, Robert found refuge in solitary activities like hunting and archery, and later on in his life, he spent 1 year in the American Army and some time working with police. In 1960, he got married at the age of 21, but during the same year, he was arrested for arson after burning down a school bus garage, which was intended as revenge for his mistreatment in high school. He spent 20 months in jail, and his wife filed for divorce, leading his life to a spiral of misery he was trying to move away from. When he received a mental evaluation from a psychiatrist, it was revealed that he's suffering from bipolar disorder and an infantile personality, meaning that he has an obsession with seeking revenge from people he thinks did him wrong. Years later, he got married again and had 2 children, and in 1967, he moved with his family to Alaska, where he opened his own bakery and became a respected member within the community. But even though he loved his job as a baker, Robert's favorite hobby was hunting and catching animals in the wilderness, which is why he became popular in the city for his trophies and records. However, in the following years, Robert's behavior began to worsen again, and he was arrested several times for theft and forcing himself on multiple women, but he managed to receive a light sentence. In 1972, after years of living in Alaska and monitoring the area, Robert began to notice that women and girls who work in the pleasure industry tend to be the most vulnerable, and they're very easy to lure. And by the way, when I say the pleasure industry, I mean women who offer intimate services for money and dancers who perform in certain clubs. You get the point. Anyway, from that point, Robert started picking up women in his car after posing as a customer. But once they get inside, he puts a gun to their head and drives them to his home. This is when horror becomes reality for these helpless women, because what awaits them behind closed doors is nothing other than torture and Robert's ruthlessness. But besides touching them repeatedly and beating them, Robert had a horrifying style when dealing with his victims that would later make him the craziest serial killer in American history. Instead of simply killing the woman and hiding his crime, Robert used his small private plane to fly her out to isolated locations in the Alaskan wilderness and then release her. Initially, the woman believes she's free and she can finally escape despite the dangerous environment, but minutes later, she realizes the whole thing is a game in which she's the prey and Robert is the hunter. And I mean it literally. In other words, after releasing the woman in the forest, Robert intentionally allows her to run away for some time to create a challenge for himself, and then he picks up his hunting rifle to hunt her down as if she's an animal. This practice was the ultimate entertainment for him, and gunning down his victim as she was desperate to escape gave him a chilling feeling of satisfaction and pride. On certain occasions, he would even use hunting knives to eliminate the prey, and it was mainly because he wanted to elevate the challenge each time. Robert was able to come up with this plan by taking advantage of Alaska's features as a gigantic state with a very low population, which means there are areas where no one would pass by or even hear the women's screams. This is what made the whole situation much more tragic, because Robert's sadistic game continued for years by kidnapping a new woman whenever he had a chance. And by 1982, 17 women and girls had already been killed after being hunted in the wilderness. I say girls because several of his victims were really young, ranging from 17 years old to 20, with the oldest victim being Lisa Futrell, who died at 41. Nevertheless, Robert had no intentions to stop, and on June 13, 1983, he met 17-year-old Cindy Paulson, and he offered her $200 to have a ride with him, but as usual, when she got in the car, he pulled out a gun and drove her to his house. However, Cindy was much more resilient than Robert anticipated, because when he was preparing his private plane to lead her to her fate in the wilderness, she managed to escape and run away even though her hands were cuffed. Eventually, she saw a passing driver and succeeded in fleeing the place with him, making her the first victim to ever survive Robert's game from hell. When she reported the incident to local police, they didn't really take her story seriously, and Robert somehow misleaded them by accusing Cindy of extortion because he refused to pay her money. This was so frustrating for the girl. Even though she knows very well that Robert is a monster, police were seeing the opposite because in their eyes, he was a respected baker who looks like a nice guy. The only person who handled Cindy's story seriously was Detective Glenn Floth, who had been investigating the disappearances of multiple women, and he felt that Cindy's descriptions match his suspicions around Robert. Long story short, after searching his home and finding items that belonged to the missing women, Robert had no choice other than confessing and leading investigators to the graves where he buried the victims. Police were able to identify 15 females, but 2 bodies were basically a mystery, despite the autopsy revealing some details about how they lost their lives. Believe it or not, it literally took 37 years for police to finally identify one of those victims as Robin Pelkey, a 19-year-old girl who went missing in 1982. And no one knew that she ended up in Robert's hands. The other victim's identity remains to this day the most perplexing puzzle in Alaska's criminal history, especially since her remains had already been largely consumed by wildlife when they were found. Police are still debating whether she was native to Alaska or came from another state, and even her age is not confirmed and believed to be between 16 and 25. It actually makes me very sad to imagine her story. We're talking about a girl who died alone in the most unbearable way possible. And after her passing, no one knows who she is, where she's from, or if there's someone who cares about her disappearance or not. And by the way, according to Robert himself, he actually killed her before even reaching his home because she tried to escape on the way. The poor girl was panicking, and she begged him not to kill her when she fell to the ground, but he ended up stabbing her with no mercy, proving that he has zero empathy whatsoever. Robert was ultimately sentenced to 460 years in prison after making a deal with the court to avoid the death penalty. And many years later, he died in 2014 due to natural causes at the age of 75, putting an end to a reign of terror that feels more disturbing than any horror movie. When I say Robert is a source of inspiration for the character of Lionel Starkweather, I'm not exaggerating, because in case you didn't know, the behavior you see from both of them was actually described by an American writer more than a century ago. The writer is Richard Connell, and he wrote a similar story in 1924 that was called The Most Dangerous Game, where he talks about how humans can become prey and be hunted like animals for sport. What's even more fascinating is that his story talks about a hunter who became bored of targeting animals and wanted to raise the challenge with humans, which is identical to how Robert felt. The author explains how moral decay plays a huge role in such behavior, and how sometimes people become addicted to a sense of thrill and authority that can only be experienced by seeing others suffer under their brutality. He also highlights how dehumanization is used as a justification by these people, because, in their eyes, if the victim is worthless or less than human, then there's no need to feel sorry for their pain. Richard's analysis in this matter led to the popularization of the term the most dangerous game syndrome to describe this type of ruthless psychology. His story masterfully hints at the sadism of the elites in society, the depravity of humans when seeking pleasure, and how a civilized person can transition into a heartless predator to satisfy a hidden desire for power. So in my opinion, Manhunt is literally the most realistic horror game ever made. It's not designed to shock you with fictional threats from the developer's imagination, but instead, it shows you that the most horrifying creature you'll ever face will always be your fellow humans. Let me know in the comments below where you stand in the Manhunt controversy and what your personal stance is on the heavy topics that were included in the story and whether you believe they're a step too far or not. Please like the video if you enjoyed it, and I hope to see you soon.
It looks like this goes all the way to the top. I can't trust anyone, least of all the police, and time's running out. I've got to get the one piece of evidence that will expose Starkweather without a shadow of a doubt. Footage and testimony of a man who was executed by the state 5 hours ago.